Good morning to all. Lucy and I will be sharing this presentation. I will share the initial slides on intervention and evaluation design, and then Lucy will continue with the results and the key messages. So to start with the background, what we found was that even though there have been successful interventions to reduce violence against female sex workers by non-paying intimate partners, addressing intimate partner violence in sex work relationship have remained a challenge in many settings. So also the global evidence shows that violence including IPV has strong association with HIV, acquisition and other risks and vulnerabilities. Therefore, Samvedana Plus was designed aiming to reduce intimate partner violence and increase condom use within intimate relationships of female sex workers. So this intervention was a 3-year intervention started in the year 2015 to 2018 and implemented by KHPT in partnership with a sex worker-led community-based organization in Bagalkot district, Karnataka, India. Samvedana Plus was largely based on learnings from the previous project called Samvedana Plus. Previous project was Samvedana, which was mainly focused on reducing violence among female sex workers from all the perpetrators, which includes clients, police, pimps, etc. Whereas the Samvedana Plus was exclusively focused on reducing the violence from the non-paying intimate partners. So the intervention was with mainly was focused on Devdasi sex workers who were aged 18 and above and had an intimate partner. Just to give you a brief on the Devdasi, in some north parts of Karnataka, basically sex work is also linked to the Devdasi system, in which families dedicate young girls to sex work as part of religious tradition, and this is traditionally accepted. The Samvedana Plus project mainly works with these women who we call as Devdasi. This project was implemented in 2 taluks of Bagalkot district of Northern Karnataka, South India. And the reach was about 800 sex workers from the 47 project villages, which were divided into 24 into intervention and 23 into the comparison group, since this was a RCT. And the project theory of change proposes to achieve the project goals by enhancing sense of self-worth among sex workers, increasing recognition that male dominance and violence is unacceptable in intimate relationship among sex workers and as well as in the intimate partners. It also includes increasing awareness of the rights of women and the law with respect to IPV among sex workers, their partners and other stakeholders, improving intimate partner relationships, sense of safety and skills of sex workers to challenge violence and unsafe sex, reducing acceptance of intimate partner violence among sex workers, community-based organizations and at a community level, and lastly, improving the capacity of the CBO to prevent and respond to the intimate partner violence. So this was the theory of change, hypothesized to achieve the project goals of reducing the intimate partner violence and increasing the condom use within the intimate relationship. So Samvedana Plus was a multi-level intervention and activities were largely carried out at individual level with both FSWs and their intimate partners. And the activities largely includes with the female sex workers and with their intimate partners. At the individual level were individual counseling, individual outreach to give some messages and all, and to give them counseling on the issues. There were individual counselings. We also formed the groups of female sex workers at the village levels to take them through the group reflection sessions to basically build trust and communication among the female sex workers, building the understanding on the relationships, reducing their risk in the intimate relationship, understanding the intimate partner violence, taking action against violence, building solidarity, changing social norms, working on improving the self-esteem and self-worth among the female sex workers. We also had activities on developing the safety plan and identification of allies among the female sex workers. Then violence response and support system was established. Leadership training was given to the selected sex workers, and there were some special events for the sex workers. Apart from this, we also the intervention also has group reflection sessions for the intimate partners of the sex workers, and also we have identified some of the intimate partners as the champions, and also they have received the training. There were also some couple of the events which were together for best FSWs and intimate partners. One of that was couple events where these events were used to basically develop the relationship among both of them, and also wherever it was required, there were couple counselings as well. Then at the next level, we had the intervention with community-based organization, the local community-based organization, which was like implementing the project, mainly to build their capacity to understand and address the intimate partner violence, and also to establish links with other women organization and department to support the existing system in the CBO. We also had some activities at the community level, which includes community dialogue, street plays, and folk shows to create awareness on the issues of intimate partner violence. So we also done some stakeholder meetings to increase awareness and relevant rights and laws with respect to the intimate partner violence. We use cluster randomized control trial design with waitlisting control to evaluate the project using mixed method. Qualitative evaluation was also embedded within the CRCT, and the quantitative studies were conducted at baseline, and after 12 months and 24 months of the program implementation, the project proposes 3 primary and 5 secondary outcomes. And the first 2 primary outcomes were on the reducing the violence. One was like experience of physical or sexual intimate partner violence in the past 6 months, and the second one was the experience of severe physical and or sexual intimate partner violence within the past 6 months. And the third outcome, primary outcome, was on increasing the consistent condom use in the intimate relationship. In the intimate partnership. These are the 3 primary outcomes, and we had set of secondary outcomes. Basically, these were on reduced acceptance of intimate partner violence among the female sex workers, increased disclosure of intimate partner violence, then improved knowledge of self-protection strategies among the female sex workers, improved self-efficacy to negotiate condom use with their IPs, and improved solidarity among around the issues of IPV among female sex workers. And for the analysis of the trial result, the analytical approach what we used includes understanding imbalances between confounders, socio-demographic characteristics, and outcomes across the arms at baseline using individual and cluster level summaries. Then presenting cluster level summaries, that is means of the cluster level means by trial arm for each primary and secondary outcome within end-line data. The primary analysis were done using an adjusted individual level intention to treat analysis, comparing outcomes in intervention and control analysis at the end line. The outcome variables were adjusted at the cluster level using mean baseline summaries, and other variables that strongly predict outcome were adjusted at the individual level using end-line data. We also conducted sensitivity analysis for the covariates that were not measured at baseline. We had two variables. One was alcohol used by the female sex workers and the migration. These are the two variables which are not measured in the baseline, and therefore we did the sensitivity analysis to understand the association of these with on the outcomes. Then, and the data analysis steps includes, before doing the data analysis, like we listed all the things, the activities needs to be carried out, and that mainly includes listing out the activities and setting the timeline for each of the activities. Then we developed unblinding protocol, which specifies everything on the data unblinding, how we go ahead with the analysis and the procedure for unblinding after the analysis and all. Then we developed the data analysis plan, where we included all the analysis related information, what will be considered as primary outcome, what is the definition, what are the tables we are going to include, what are the timelines and other things we included in the data analysis plan. These are the things we decided. And then next it includes, we also developed the statistical analysis plan, which clearly tells about what are the statistical analysis we are going to conduct on the trial data, and what are the things we'll use as a statistics, and what will be our end results, how it will be presented and all. So then as a next step, after finalizing these things, we actually performed the data analysis. Statistician from KHPT analyzed the data, and then the primary findings were discussed in a small group, which was actually where there were members from LSSTM and KHPT, and the preliminary findings were discussed within the group under confidentiality agreement. After that, after looking at the findings, then we also carried out some additional explorations for the better understanding of the results. So this slide gives you the summary of the trial timeline. This trial was basically discussed and planned before 2014. The discussion on project components, intervention and evaluation design, and identification of clusters or villages, and profiling of the female sex workers and their partners happened before 2014. And after that, we did the quantitative baseline survey with female sex workers and intimate partners in the year 2014, along with baseline in-depth interviews, that is qualitative studies. So we finished in the month of around June, July, August. And later what happened is, because of the funding constraint, we could not start the project immediately after the baseline. So actually the intervention started almost after 8 months of the baseline, that is in the month of April 2015. And then we did the midline quantitative study as per the plan after the 12 months of the initiation of the intervention, along with all other qualitative studies. Then again after 12 months, the end-line study was conducted again with the female sex workers and along with the all qualitative studies, and the intervention ended in the month of May 2017. Then also after end-line study, the intervention we tried to continue in the control villages, and we continued up to March 2018. So in between, just in the beginning of the year 2018, we also finished our trial analysis, and we had our results ready, and we also planned some assessments in the first month of 2018 to some rapid assessments to understand the results in a better way. Then, coming to the recruitment of the participants, the study recruited the participants for the quantitative study using the list of eligible sex workers available with the CBO, that's community-based organization, which was updated regularly. All the eligible sex workers listed from the 47 villages were approached for face-to-face interview by the trained research staff, and those who consented to participate were interviewed in each round of the study. So, project outreach workers and the peer educators from the targeted intervention helped the research staff in identifying the FSWs in the village for the study. Basically, we selected all the participants from the list of female sex workers who had intimate partner or reported intimate partner in the past 6 months, which was regularly updated with the CBO, and then the same list was used for recruiting the participants for each round of the study. So, in the baseline, we had around 400 plus sex workers from control area, of which we could interview 72% of them, and from intervention we could complete 81% of the list. Then after that, again, after the baseline, as I said before, there was a 12-month gap between the intervention and the baseline. Then we did the midline after 12 months of intervention, which was actually 24 months from the baseline. So we could do we could achieve 85% of the response rate in the control area and 92% in the intervention area. Then again, in the end line, the response rate was about 75% in the control area and 99% in the intervention area. So some of the main reasons when we did the baseline for non-interviewing the participants was majority of them reason was migration, whereas if you see the end line, we had more refusals from the control area, and there were some refusals in the intervention area as well. So this is all about intervention and the evaluation. Now I request Lucy to take you through the rest of the slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Prakash.
Thank you.
So let me move on to the findings. So this slide summarizes the findings of our primary analysis, so the individual level analysis on primary outcomes at end line. So the column on the left shows our primary outcomes, and then the rows at the top show the prevalence of the outcomes, first in the control and then in the intervention arm, and then the unadjusted model and the adjusted model. So as you can see from this slide, we found no difference in reports of any physical or sexual violence from intimate partners in the past 6 months between intervention and control arm in either the unadjusted or the adjusted model. Similarly, we found no difference in any severe physical or sexual violence from intimate partners in the past 6 months between trial arms. Nor did we find any difference in reports of consistent condom use in intimate relationships within the past 30 days between control arm. Sorry, next slide. I'm trying to move on to the next slide. There seems to be some delay. So this slide shows findings from the analysis, the primary analysis on our secondary outcomes, and the slide is constructed in the same way as the previous slide. So as you can see, we did find that Samvedana Plus was associated with decreased acceptance of intimate partner violence by sex workers. So you can see a lower proportion of sex workers in the intervention arm and Samvedana Plus reported accepting intimate partner violence compared to the control arm, with reduced odds of reporting acceptance of violence in the adjusted model. We found no difference in disclosure of intimate partner violence among sex workers associated with the intervention, Samvedana Plus. We did find that knowledge of self-protection strategies against intimate partner violence was increased in Samvedana Plus villages compared to the control villages, with increased odds of reporting knowledge about self-protection strategies of 1.73 associated with Samvedana Plus in the adjusted model. We found no difference in reports of self-efficacy to negotiate condom use with intimate partner violence associated with the intervention, Samvedana Plus. But we did find increase in reports of solidarity among sex workers around issues of intimate partner violence associated with Samvedana Plus. And you can see from the odds ratio there of 1.69, there's increased odds of reporting solidarity among sex workers among the intervention arm. So some mixed findings associated with that. We found mixed findings with the end-line analysis. So no association with no effect on our primary outcomes, but some effect on our secondary outcomes. And as Prakash mentioned at the beginning, in addition to the individual level analysis, we also looked at differences in cluster level means at end lines, and we found as a sensitivity analysis to corroborate our individual level analysis. And the cluster level analysis showed a similar pattern in findings. There's no difference in our primary outcomes, but some differences in our secondary outcomes that were broadly consistent between with the individual level analysis. The only difference we found was that with the cluster level summary suggested that the self-efficacy to negotiate condom use with intimate partners increased in communities receiving Samvedana Plus intervention compared to those in the control. But we found no difference in reports of solidarity around intimate partner violence issues at a cluster level in Samvedana Plus villages compared to the controls. So those are the only two differences in the analyses. So this slide summarizes cluster level reports of increased of intimate partner violence at baseline, midline, and endline. So the first graph summarizes reports of any physical or sexual intimate partner violence in the past 6 months. And the red line indicates reports of intimate partner violence in the Samvedana Plus villages, the intervention villages, and the blue line shows reports in the control villages. So if you can see at baseline, we found that marked differences in reports of any physical or sexual violence in the past 6 months between intervention and control villages, with lower reports of violence in the intervention villages as 25.9% compared to the control villages of 41.8%. And what we saw was a very sharp increase in reports of intimate partner violence in the intervention villages between baseline and midline, increasing from 25.9% to 63.3%, and then a sharp decline to 9% at endline. And this pattern was repeated for the control villages as well, with a slight increase between baseline and midline, and then a sharp increase at endline. Similarly, in reports of severe physical and or sexual intimate partner violence in the past 6 months, that's represented in the second graph on the right, We again found differences in baseline reports of severe physical or sexual violences between intervention and control villages, with lower reports of violence reported at baseline and intervention compared to control, and then a sharp increase between baseline and midline, and then a sharp decline at endline. This was consistent across both intervention and control, though more marked in intervention villages. So this casts doubts on our ability to interpret the reports of intimate partner violence at endline, prompting us to conduct further analyses to try and interpret these findings. So this slide shows the this slide again just shows some of the imbalances between the primary and secondary outcomes at baseline. So you can see the first graph just shows the differences in outcomes at baseline between intervention arms represented by the green graph and control arms represented by the purple graph. So you can see across all primary outcomes there were differences in reports of violence at baseline and consistent condom use between intervention and control. And similarly, with consistently lower levels of violence and lower levels of condom use reported in intervention villages compared to control. For the secondary outcomes, there was some consistency in reports at baseline in self-efficacy to use condoms with intimate partners and knowledge of self-protection strategies at baseline. But again, differences in acceptance of intimate partner violence, disclosure of intimate partner violence, and solidarity of intimate partner violence at baseline. So just to summarize the key results of the primary analyses. So we found no difference between Samvedana Plus villages and comparison villages in the key outcomes of reported intimate partner violence and consistent condom use. We also found that a sharp decline was observed in reports of physical and/or sexual intimate partner violence by female sex workers in all communities, intervention and control, between baseline and endlines. So the very low levels of these outcomes reported at endline appear unrealistically low, sort of leading us to question their validity. It was clear that new questions had emerged as a result of these findings. The increase that we observed in intimate partner violence in intervention villages between baseline and midline raised the possibility that perhaps it was Samvedana Plus, the intervention itself, may have increased intimate partner violence in the short term. And we also needed to understand the dramatic drop we saw in intimate partner violence reported at endline in both groups, and the lack of difference we observed in intimate partner violence at endline. So this prompted us to undertake some additional analyses to answer this question. And we did this, as Prakash has described, through a sort of rapid assessment post-unblinding of the results. We analysed program monitoring data. We conducted some quick rapid assessment interviews with sex workers and field workers and program delivery people responsible for delivering the intervention in the field, as well as reviewing the linked qualitative study data that had been conducted in parallel to the trial to try and understand these results. So, firstly, this slide summarizes some of the program data the monitoring data to look at the reports of intimate partner violence reported by participants of the intervention during the implementation of the intervention. So, as you can see from this slide, this slide shows the number of reports of intimate partner violence acts along the left axis, and then the right axis, the right vertical axis shows the numbers of sex workers reporting these intimate partner violence acts, and then the y-axis shows the duration of the intervention. So as you can see from the slide, the monitoring data suggests that reports of intimate partner violence did increase slightly following the start of the intervention in April 2015 to July and September 2015. And then it increased more sharply after the module on intimate partner violence was introduced in group sessions, which occurs between October and December 2015. But then it remained steady throughout the study implementation period. So one explanation of this could be that the initial increase represented increased reporting by sex workers due to increased awareness of what constitutes intimate partner violence. And this theory was substantiated by reports of the community-based organization that delivered the intervention. So this reassured us that perhaps it's unlikely that the higher levels of violence, of intimate partner violence reported at midline, represents a true program-induced increase in violence frequency. In addition, the crisis management teams that were responsible for assisting sex workers to address and hear and collate reports of intimate partner violences at the villages. They didn't receive any reports from sex workers of violent episodes linked specifically to the intervention. Nor did the outreach workers register reports of increased violence during the time. We also looked at the data to see whether the proportion of relationships between intervention and control arms differed during the study period. The reports of ending of relationships differed between intervention and control arms during the study period, and there was no difference in the proportion of relationships that ended between intervention and control. So taking these factors together, we were reassured that the Samvedana Plus hadn't resulted in hadn't caused increased intimate partner violence between baseline and endline. So going on to think about whether why we saw such a sharp decrease in intimate partner violence at endline, and our rapid assessment and qualitative interviews suggested perhaps that there's both methodological and contextual factors which might have contributed to the sharp decline in reports of intimate partner violence seen at endline, and to the lack of intervention effect. So we believe that perhaps the CBO staff, the community-based organisation staff who delivered the intervention, perhaps encouraged behaviour that undermined the integrity of the trial in two ways. Firstly, the CBO and existing peer educators that worked across both intervention and control village providing HIV-related counselling prioritised the well-being of sex workers over the integrity of the trial by enlisting assistance of the more highly trained, highly qualified Samvedana Plus staff to assist women experiencing violence when they identified a need, irrespective of whether they were in the intervention villages or the control villages. Secondly, the CBO staff who were responsible for facilitating access to participants for the research team. We believe that they may have instructed participants on how to respond to key questions in order to register a positive effect of the intervention and guarantee wider availability of the intervention and continuation of the work that they believed to be important. Encouraging staff to misreport incidents of intimate partner violence and over-report consistent condom use with intimate partners. There's other contextual factors that may have contributed to the lack of effect between intervention and control arm and the decrease in intimate partner violence at end-line. So those district-wide campaigns were conducted at in parallel to the intervention, to the implementation of Samvedana Plus during the study. This included activities such as 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, as well as events to mark International Women's Day. At the same time, there was also an establishment of a high-level commission to study the status of sex workers in Karnataka, which could have resulted in increased stigmatization around intimate partner violence and sex work, and therefore led to underreporting of intimate partner violence. However, since acceptance of violence by sex workers remained high throughout the study period, as shown in between our baseline and midline and endline survey reports, we don't believe that the precipitous declines in intimate partner violence reported at endline is a result of these contextual factors, and more likely reflects the actions undertaken by the CBO than actual impact of the district-wide events. So this slide summarizes some of the findings from the linked qualitative studies conducted by colleagues alongside the trial, and it showed some challenges in the implementation of the intervention. We found that, in fact, few of the intimate partner partners were interested in discussing intimate partner violence. And the male outreach workers had a very challenging time facilitating group sessions discussing intimate partner violence, as men insisted that physical violence and beatings was often an indication of an established relationship and love with their partners. There was also sort of cultural issues and sort of due to sort of older men and intimate partners recruited into the study, into the intervention, not respecting sort of the messages of or opinion of the outreach workers, who were often younger men, and therefore sort of failing to listen to the messages that were being conveyed. And overall participation in these group sessions was poor, with men only showing interest in discussions around sex and condom use. Similarly, we found that the question of privacy was a hindrance in providing services. And the relationships between men and the Devadasi sex workers were highly stigmatized, and the prevailing desire was to keep these relationships secret, away and hidden from communities and families and friends. And this acted as a barrier to implementing the interventions, to both implementing the interventions and the ability for counsellors to discuss, to get people to engage into the intervention, as well as to discuss violence within the counselling sessions. So it was often difficult as well to discuss issues around sex work within these counselling sessions, as women often hid the fact that they continued in sex work from their partners. So for fear that it would result in further violence or punishment from their partners. So this made it very difficult for the outreach workers to openly discuss sex work or provide condom use within the context of the of counselling or the intervention, and they had to take the lead from sex workers and only discuss these issues when it was clear from the women that it was okay to do so. But I think the key point is that the fact that these relationships are modelled on traditional marriages, where and acceptance of intimate partner violence is high in traditional marriages, and therefore high within these relationships where the women wanted to reassure themselves that their relationships were like traditional marriages, as this sort of conveyed gave them more social status and acceptance in the community. Okay, so just to sum up, the takeaway messages that we get from the trial is the fact that perhaps these cluster randomized controlled trials may not be feasible or the most appropriate way to evaluate this kind of complex intervention, particularly when implemented by local groups whose primary allegiance is to helping beneficiaries. And they may not understand the sort of science or accept the logic of the trial methodology. It also shows the importance and value of having ongoing monitoring of program implementation and linked qualitative results as essential to help us interpret often confusing findings. It's clear that perhaps there's different ways and different thinking about designing the intervention is needed, and delivering the intervention within the context of these complex relationships. And it's clear that it's also clear that intimate partner violence is high within sex worker communities, and there's a need to include sex workers in the broader discourse around intimate partner violence. I think it's worth noting that Samvedana Plus was a very different intervention from other intimate partner violence trials, as it focused on this very specific and highly marginalized population of Devadasi sex workers. I think the findings, key message on the trial is I think that there is a need to address intimate partner violence more broadly in communities and societies, and addressing gender inequalities before like a targeted intervention such as Samvedana Plus is going to work within this highly marginalized population. So further structural and policy changes are needed to challenge acceptance of violence in communities. So violence was sort of a normative expectation of marriage, and therefore welcomed by the Devadasi women, as I've explained. So the heightened stigma and violence experienced by these Devadasi women will reduce impact of any targeted interventions before addressing more broadly intimate partner violence at a community level. Okay, so that's all I want to say today. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the co-authors and all the sex workers who participated in the study. And Prakash and I will be very happy to take any questions.
Lucy and Prakash. So we do have a couple of questions already. Just to remind people, if they want to type questions into the little box on the left, that's one way, or you can unmute yourself, I believe, by pressing *7 and speaking. But we've got 2 questions related to measures, which are kind of good ones to start with, and then a slightly more complicated one, which should be fascinating to hear your response. So the 2 questions, both from B2 Ringwald, really about how did you define some of your secondary measures? So specifically, how did you define disclosure of IPV? And then what self-protection strategies did you consider to measure knowledge of strategies? And, how did that kind of get operationalized?
Okay. For the first question, what BT asked is about defining the disclosure of IPV. Actually, we have asked questions on if the FSW experienced violence, then whether they told about that experiencing violence from IP to someone else after the incident. So the options are whether they shared this with some other sex workers or their friends and family members or the CBO. And if they responded yes to any of this, they told about the violence incidents to someone else, so that we are considering as disclosure of violence. And coming to the next question on the secondary outcome on self-protection strategies, the intervention, as a part of intervention actually worked on developing some of the self-protection strategies for the FSWs, and in that there were self-protection strategies like identifying allies who can help them in case of violence, and identifying some individual countermeasures to avoid the violence, and approaching approaching for the protection orders. These are the things what intervention actually help sex workers to do. Out of this, actually, we considered first 2 as whether they identified allies or they identified any individual countermeasures to protect themselves from the violence. These are the 2 things what we consider to just create the secondary outcome on secondary outcome, that is self-protection strategies, whether they have or not. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Prakash. So I've got a third question, which was in the chat box, and then if people want to ask questions after that, otherwise I've got lots of questions myself. So, and I think this is a really important question which Eleanor has typed in, because it gets to the heart of the issue that you've raised already around the spike in reported IPV at midline. So she says, as far as I understand it, reporting of violence does commonly go up as women. Oh, Eleanor calls Annie Holmes. Sorry, so this is Annie Holmes speaking. It does go up as women become aware it's not inevitable or acceptable features of relationships. And is this broadly the case? And I guess and she then goes on to say, and were there any other characteristics from other studies useful in interpreting results in these results, And I think I wanted to kind of build on that and say, are there other studies where this has been seen to happen as well? Because obviously it gets to the heart of, can we use these types of evaluation methodologies? So that would be, yeah. So Lucy and Prakash. What's your response?
Prakash, do you want to respond, or? I mean, I've got some.
Lucy, I think, yeah, you can.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so no, it's a very good question. So yes, I mean, I'm aware of evidence from other trials of microfinance programs and socioeconomic empowerment programs that suggest that reports of intimate partner violence does increase following awareness around these issues of what constitutes violence, which we have referred to to further support our conclusion that the sharp increase at midline wasn't attributed to a real increase in violence and the intervention causing harm. But I mean, I think it's just the fact that then we have the sharp decline in intimate partner violence at end-line just really sort of throws into questions of the validity of the findings across the validity of the reports of intimate partner violence across baseline, across midline and end-line in particular. So when you ask about other characteristics from other studies, could you perhaps elaborate on what you mean? I'm not totally sure.
So I'm reading Annie's question, but I think in some ways you've answered it in the sense that it's seen in other studies, and I guess these kind of patterns. I also wanted to ask about, in your monitoring data, you saw specifically a sharp rise in emotional IPV reported, and I wondered if you had reflected on what particularly about the intervention was it? Was there a big focus on emotional IPV? Was it just something which was much more commonly reported? Why in particular that form of kind of violence?
Prakash, do you want to answer this? I think you're more familiar with the monitoring data.
I think, and it's good if you can just repeat the question because the line was breaking just.
Sorry. So in the monitoring data, the one thing which is very obvious is the rate of emotional IPV reported kind of jumps up and stays very, very high once the intervention starts. So I wondered, really, did the intervention focus specifically on emotional IPV? I'm trying to understand why that in particular kind of spiked.
It was not intervention just focused on one of the emotional or this one. Intervention was mainly the focus was same, reducing the severe as well as the emotional. I don't think this is just because of intervention focus on particular type of violence. As I think, as the slide shows that immediately after that month of July to September, where we just done the module on the violence aspects and all. So if you see most of the emotional and as well as we can see there's increase in reporting of physical violence. I don't think there is any specific reason to any specific focus on emotional violence.
I think it's also worth noting that emotional violence was often the most frequently reported type of violence experienced by sex workers across the surveys. In general, I mean, you can see that from the graph.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks. Does anyone else have a question? We've got about 4 minutes left. People they can unmute themselves and ask it by pressing *7. Otherwise, I've got another question. I've got lots of questions. Give anyone a second. Otherwise, I'll ask it. Okay. While everyone gets their ideas and questions together. So I think one of the fascinating things that were raised was the challenges of engaging the male partners. You know, there's this big push around engaging male partners, and I think, you know, what you showed us and what you talked about and what the kind of other qualitative work your team has done really emphasizes the complexities and diversities in how we characterize male partners. So I was just wondering, any thoughts on how you would kind of develop an intervention working with those male partners of sex workers kind of going forward? You know, what would your kind of key strategies be? Or is it, you know, just too complicated and much better to focus just on working with the sex workers themselves?
Well, I mean, I have a view, and so Prakash, maybe I'll answer. Shall I answer, and then you can chip in because your view might differ.
Yeah.
I think we conclude, one of the conclusions we've come to from this experience is that you know, what's needed first of all, and I mentioned this before, you try and work with this very high, you know, marginalized population and this very stigmatized relationship, is that you first of all need to address sort of gender inequalities and intimate partner violence more broadly in communities to reduce acceptance around intimate partner violence. And that's the only way you're going to change behaviors, if the relationships are modeled on sort of traditional marriages. So you need to reduce acceptance of violence within those traditional marriages and relationships, first of all. I think there's also a need for sort of more community-based empowerment and mobilization among sex workers. You know, there's been lots of evidence from elsewhere internationally and in India to show how those kind of interventions can reduce violence and HIV among sex workers. So I think the resources and focus of interventions need to be on sort of those kind of empowerment and mobilization interventions among sex workers, first of all, to sort of, you know, to help sort of counter poverty and stigmatization among those populations before you try and work with these on changing sort of dynamics of intimate relationships. So that's the approach that we conclude is needed. But Prakash, I don't know whether you've got any other observations to make to answer Andrew's question more specifically about how to work with men.
Yeah, I thank you, Lucy, and I agree with you that this the men where we work with is the relationship is completely different, and I think this is we tried the strategies because the relationship and the type of intimate partners, they are from different backgrounds and other things. So and the relationship complexities among these relationships was really a challenge to work with the work with these intimate partners. Really speaking, at the moment, I'm also not able to add something on working with these IPs. Yeah.
No, thank you. I think, kind of strategies for engaging kind of partners are very diverse rather than seeing them as a homogenous group is kind of crucial for thinking through. So it's brilliant.
Yeah.
It's just, and I think, as you said, Lucy, that kind of wider work first is probably a critical foundation to kind of work off. Really good.
I think it's important.
Sorry.
Oh no! The intervention was multi-level. So there was attempts. So there was work done at sort of the village level to through street plays and media work to try and address questions around gender inequalities and intimate partner violence. But I think And that's also been shown to be successful in changing the sort of normative environment in Avahan, but I think there's less focus on that kind of community mobilization within Samvedana Plus. And what we've learned is perhaps that we needed more of that in order to sort of try and shift norms around intimate partner violence, in order to have an impact on violence within these relationships.